and it's only remains for me to hand over to you. The recording has started, so thank you very much, Erica, for stepping up to do this, and I will let you run it and explain how we're going to go forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank, and it's nice to see everybody. My name is Erica Brummel, and I'll be chairing this session. Just a few housekeeping rules. We have 3 speakers today who will each be presenting successively, and at the end we'll have a short question period, which will be moderated, and we can take questions by chat or through audio if you raise your hand. So if you have any questions or points of discussion for the presenter, please feel free to note them down, and we will take care of it at the end of all the presentations, sorry. So let's just jump right into it. I'll introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Quinn Barber, who is a PhD student at Carleton who's investigating the use of remote sensing for mapping and predicting peatland wildfires. He's from Edmonton, where he works at the Canadian Forest Service supporting research in wildfire ecology, climate change-driven increases in wildfire frequency, and wildfire satellite remote sensing. I'll hand it over to you, Quinn.
Thanks, Erica. Everybody hear me all right? Okay. Yeah, thanks for coming for our talk today, everybody. I'm going to talk about Canadian peatlands and how they're vulnerable to drought and how we do remote sensing of peatlands. Nope. Here we go. So to start things off, I'm going to introduce the main character. That's peatlands. Here they are. This picture is a typical mix of upland forest, lowland peatlands, and lakes. You might see this in the boreal plains or on the Canadian Shield. Our lab loves peatlands, should be obvious. Not only because for much of human history, they were considered this waste of space, you know, the swamp, the mire, but also because they are a key component of preventing climate change due to the enormous amount of carbon that's stored in them. Also, I think they're actually quite beautiful. So we're going to look at a few more pictures of peatlands. Here's another one. This is a patterned fen in Wood Buffalo National Park. And just one more. Here is another peatland complex from the Athabasca River Delta region. Peatlands look totally otherworldly compared to the sort of landscapes we normally see in southern Canada. But they actually cover an enormous amount of Canada. 12% of Canada are peatlands, and that gives us a quarter of the world's peatlands. So peatlands are defined by their accumulation of organic matter. They don't accumulate organic matter quickly, but they do it over time. It's a slow rate of accumulation. And this species of moss, sphagnum in this picture, grows and it dies, and it grows and it dies, and it gets buried over time below the water table in waterlogged conditions. And that carbon is fixed and the rate of decay is very slow. So over time, these peatlands become enormous reserves of carbon that's just trapped underground and held there. The carbon that's currently held in Canadian peatlands is very approximately equal to 25 years of global carbon emissions. So this is a figure that I put in to show how peatlands stay stable for so long in the face of thousands of years of wildfire, because our forests do burn, they burn regularly. And it's because of this high water table and the characteristics of the moss, the peat moss that grows in peatlands. So sphagnum from the last slide helps to maintain that high water table through an eco-hydrological feedback, which keeps them resistant to fire. Not only is the water table high because of surface geology conditions, but the capillary action of the peat actually draws water upwards and keeps them wet. The wildfires in this case only burn the surface of the peatland. In this study, they found that 3% of the peat was lost in one particularly large wildfire. However, the peatland on the right has been drained for many reasons that happens. It could be natural because of drought. It could be because the drainage was done for agricultural reasons. But because that water table is depressed, the fire is quite severe. It burns deeply, and they found 51% of the peat was lost. And even worse, if it burns deeply, the peat may actually, the sphagnum species may be eliminated from the site, and this may actually convert to a different land cover type entirely. So this is a meteorology talk, so I'll talk a little bit about meteorology. The critical thing about peatlands is drought and precipitation. So wildfire in upland forests is more strongly related to the relative humidity and to the wind speed, and we applied this through the Canadian Fire Weather Index system. But peatlands, drought is a factor of critical importance because it can increase the depth of burn, it can lower that water table and make it more vulnerable to fire. This is what happened in the catastrophic fire season of 2023, especially in Alberta and British Columbia and Northwest Territories. So these two figures on the top of the slide show the percentage area under drought for Alberta and British Columbia, and the dotted line is 2023. This solid line is 2024. You can see there was just a lot of drought going on. And especially in the latter half of 2023, when you'd expect to see the fall precipitation and the snowfall sort of bring that drought level back down, it actually still stayed high. We got almost no snow until January that year, the next year. So this led to an increase in what we call holdover fires. So I will say it's the media called these zombie fires. My supervisor at CFS hates that word, but I'm going to use it. These are fires. This is a picture of a holdover fire from near Fort Smith, near Wood Buffalo National Park. It's right beside the highway. It was smoking all winter, really scaring the residents. And holdover fires burn deep underground, and they smolder at such a low temperature. It's not a flaming combustion, it's a smoldering combustion that they can actually burn throughout the winter under the snowpack. And when that snowpack melts, they reemerge in the spring and create an anomalously early spring wildfire, especially when all the grass is still cured. So it moves very quickly. And in 2024, we saw over 150 holdover fires in Alberta and British Columbia alone. That's way more than we've ever seen before. There's a lot more research to be done here, though, because we really don't know when they happen, how they happen. It's hard to predict. So if we can get a better idea at what threshold of drought these holdover fires initiate, we can get a better understanding of how peatlands are going to behave and how resilient they are under climate change. So just talking a little bit more about the 2023 fires, we all remember this year, it was the worst fire year on record. And what was interesting is when you look at it from a peatland perspective, we saw 46% more peatland wildfire than would be expected in a standard year, in a normal year. And most of that increase came from a fourfold increase in the burn rate in poor fens. And we're still sort of figuring out why that happened, why it's fens, not bogs. But fens are minerotrophic, meaning that they're groundwater fed instead of just rainwater fed. And so it's possible that has something to do with why they were more fire vulnerable under these drought conditions. Yeah, it may be that these peatlands are not resilient to climate change when we hit this critical threshold of drought, but we're still figuring that bit out. So before I'm running out of time, I want to talk briefly about how we map burned areas. Visual satellite imagery, like the image on the right, is not the greatest tool for figuring out where wildfire occurred. So we use multispectral indices to determine where wildfire has burnt and where it hasn't. Two of the traditional ones are DNBR and RBR. This is a map of DNBR, which is calculated from the infrared band and the shortwave infrared band. In this case, I used Sentinel-2. This specific image is from a peatland wildfire near the town of Tomahawk in Alberta. And I chose it to show how difficult it can be to detect low severity wildfire and determine where it actually burned. So these are two little areas I want to look at. If you look at the top right area, you have to ask yourself, did that burn? Well, according to the traditional metrics that we use for upland forests, probably, maybe not, maybe yes, it's very borderline. We think it burned, but when peat is harvested, it's already very dark. It's already a dark, dark substance. And so when it burns, it doesn't look that different, even in the infrared. So we think it burned there, but we're not sure. In the bottom left, even more difficult. You can tell it burned on the right, maybe not on the left. So an active area of research for us is comparing these traditional severity metrics to new ones that aren't traditionally used for upland forests, like maybe NDMI or many of these other acronyms I won't roll off. But another thing we're using is UAV flights and field data to compare against the satellite imagery and find out how we can better determine where burnt areas were in peatlands. And just for comparison, here's an upland forest. Like, look at that. It's very clear that this is working much better when the severity is high. So I think I'm out of time, but I want to just say that one method we can use that has a meteorological bent to it is we look at historical fires and the climatological and meteorological relationships between fire, drought, fire severity, and holdover fire initiation. So to that extent, with CFS, we put together this data set called the Canadian Fire Spread data set. We look at all the fires and exactly under which conditions they burned. And it's all open and online, so you're welcome to take a look at it. Just Google it. But once again, this is still early stages research for us, so I don't have any conclusions to share. So thank you. I put questions, but please hold your questions till the end of the 3 talks.
Thank you so much, Quinn. That was super interesting. And as you had mentioned, if there's any points of discussion, feel free to note them down and we can discuss during the question period at the end of this session.
Thanks, Erica.
I will hand it over to Yasemin Amini, who is also from Carleton. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, working under the supervision of Dr. Corinne Millard. Yasemin's interest in soil moisture dynamics began during her MSc project, where she improved hydrological models using satellite soil moisture data assimilation. Building on this foundation, today she'll be presenting on synthetic aperture radar and soil moisture active passive satellites for monitoring soils in Canada. Take it away, Yasemin.
Thanks, Erica. Hello, everyone. Today, my talk is focused on soil moisture monitoring to assess wildfire susceptibility in peatlands. Oops. Okay. So I think Quinn already covered all the basics, so I won't go over them again. We all know what peatlands are and why they matter. So under normal condition, peatlands are resilient to fire, but with climate change, they are drying out and become more flammable, and that's why we are seeing more fire happening in peatlands during recent years. So the problem is that the most wildfire models were not built for peatlands. They use fuel moisture indices designed just for upland areas, which don't really capture peatland conditions. So we need to monitor peatland moisture better. And to do that, we are using SAR and radiometer to detect drought and predict wildfire risk. To understand how peatlands dry out before burning, we use time series analysis of Sentinel-1 backscatter, and we compared peatland that have burned to those that they didn't, looking for patterns in moisture loss. SAR backscatter is really useful because it's so sensitive to surface wetness, vegetation structure, and water content. And since peatland lose moisture before they burn, we expected to see a drop in SAR backscatter leading up to fire events. So our main goal was to see if there was a clear difference in backscatter trend before the fire and between burned and unburned peatlands. And more importantly, how far in advance we could detect these warning signals. So we needed to take a look at the trends. But there's a strong seasonal cycle in backscatter that aligns with plant growth and moisture changes. And plus, there's always some noise known as speckle in SAR data. And to deal with this, we use time series decomposition, a method that breaks down the data into trend, seasonality, and noise. So we could focus on the real drying pattern leading up to the fire. So here we randomly selected over 10,000 peatland locations across Canada. You can see it on the top left figure, all the sample points. And on the bottom, you can see an example of how we decompose Sentinel-1 backscatter data. The blue line is the raw data, and then we break it down into seasonality, trend, and noise. We tested multiple time intervals before wildfires, specifically 3, 6, 12, 18 months before the fire to see if we could detect reduction in backscatter. Then we calculated tailsend slope of the trend at each of these time period. And on the right side, you can see all the detrended time series with burn side at the top and unburned side at the bottom. And here, what we found at 3 and 6 months before a fire, burn side mostly show negative trend, meaning that they are drying out, right? But for 12 months and 18 months before the fire, the trends were all over the place, both in burn side and unburned side, which showing that the drought signal might not be as clear that far in advance. So we can use this information alongside fire weather data to estimate fire probability in peatlands. So all of this is explained in detail in Millard et al. 2022. She's my supervisor. So if you're interested in more detail, please check out this paper. So due to the confounding effects of variability in vegetation and surface roughness, modeling soil moisture in peatlands directly from SAR backscatter is not always straightforward. So building on previous research, we developed a fire probability model using some key metrics from Sentinel-1 and also some common Sentinel-2 multispectral indices, including greenness, soil moisture, and vegetation moisture. And here you can see all the predictors we use in the model. And for estimate fire probability at peatland locations, we use algorithm called extreme gradient boosting. And we also included distance to human infrastructure as a predictor, which helps the model better account for human-caused fire. Here's an example of our result showing the probability of burning for June 2021. And the model correctly identified most of the fire event, meaning that it almost didn't miss actual fires, but there were quite a few false positive, which brought the overall accuracy down to around 60%. So the most important predictors were moisture-related indices from Sentinel-2, and also we were interested to see if SAR data is important for us or not. So we tested different versions of model with and without SAR backscatter, and we found SAR data improved accuracy when combined with multispectral data, but SAR backscatter alone didn't have enough information in peatland at least, which needs better filtering and correction method to be more effective. Again, this is another paper written by one of our previous postdocs. So if you're interested, just check out this paper. To get more frequent and global soil moisture data, we can also use radiometer-based soil moisture product. But the challenge is that these sensors have a very coarse spatial resolution, which means each pixel covers a large area and often includes multiple land cover types. So you can see an example in this image, just one SMAP pixel cover almost the entire Ottawa region, including Mirbeau, part of Ottawa River, and also croplands at the bottom. So we really don't know how much each of these land cover types contributes to the soil moisture estimation within just one pixel. And here, when we look at the soil moisture value in peatlands area, they are not very accurate, often overestimated or underestimated, because soil moisture is estimated using brightness temperature combined with other ancillary data, land cover, NDVI, soil texture, or water fraction. And the problem is that these inputs are either incorrect for peatlands or remain static over time, which doesn't capture real changes in wetland conditions. So for example, if you think about water bodies in wetland regions, so many small water bodies appear just after snow melt and disappear as it gets warmer. So if we rely on static data, these temporary water bodies are not accounted for and makes error in soil moisture estimation. When we compare the land cover data used by SMAP with actual ground condition, we see that even the land cover classification doesn't properly capture wetland area. So looking at figures, on the left side, we have satellite imagery. In the middle, there is an accurate classification map produced by Nick Pontone, a person who is who is going to talk after me. And on the right, we see the modest land cover map used by SMAP, where wetland area are incorrectly classified as woody savanna. So we do have lots of land cover types, and each of these land cover types have different sets of parameters in SMAP algorithm to estimate soil moisture. So to improve soil moisture estimation, it's so crucial to use the right land cover type. We wanted to see if we could find a fully wetland pixel anywhere across Canada, because we really don't want it to deal with multiple land cover type within a pixel. And after searching, we found fewer than 30 pixels and compared them to fully upland pixels, since we think they are very different. In this figure, the red pixels represent all SMAP pixel over Canada, and the white pixels are the few where we do have more than 95% wetland proportion. And this is an example of how emissivity differs between wetland and upland pixel in 2022. And as you can see, the emissivity values are quite different. And now that we have extracted all the data for these pixels, and the next step is going to calibrate the parameters in SMAP soil moisture algorithm to improve the accuracy. Beyond that, we are going to incorporate a dynamic water body map and making sure that we use a more accurate wetland, peatland classification map. And finally, once we refine this improvement, we will integrate SMAP soil moisture into fire probability model that I just explained it earlier, helping us better assess wildfire risk in peatlands. That's all for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yasemin. That was very, very interesting. Building off of this presentation, I'll next introduce Nick Pontone, who is a PhD student at Carleton as well, and his research focuses on the remote sensing of peatlands with an emphasis on modeling, mapping, and monitoring their eco-hydrological characteristics. He's currently working to advance our understanding of the interactions between synthetic aperture radar and peat soils, aiming to improve soil moisture models and INSAR methodologies in peatlands. Nick's work frequently incorporates multi-sensor remote sensing techniques, including SAR, INSAR, optical, and spaceborne LiDAR data, alongside machine learning and time series analysis. So I'll hand it over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking today about interferometric coherence in peatlands and the implications of that for INSAR analysis and SAR analysis in general. And this is some work I've been doing in collaboration with my supervisor, Corinne Millard. So Yazzie talked briefly about synthetic aperture radar in peatlands. I'm going to talk a little bit more. So SAR is an active remote sensing instrument. It emits electromagnetic radiation in the microwave domain, and it's very sensitive to water. That's why it's so useful for natural targets. And this is really based on something we call the dielectric constant, which is how we express sort of the interaction of electromagnetic waves with a medium. So vegetation canopy in microwave wavelengths is a medium, soil is a medium. And this is because water is a polar molecule. So when you have a lot of polar molecules together, when an external electromagnetic field is applied, they all rotate which induces an electromagnetic field which resists the external electric field. So generally, when we have higher moisture, either in vegetation or soil, we see more backscatter and SAR, more reflection. And conversely, when we have drier conditions, we see less backscatter. And peat tends to be quite saturated, largely because of its position in the landscape and also because of its porosity. So if you take a look at the figure on the right, you can see that's a sort of a zoomed in picture of peat soil, and there's sort of large macropores marked with the Roman numeral 1 there. There's sort of like these medium pores that are actually the cells of the sphagnum mosses that Quinn talked about. And then we also have hyaline cells, which is marked with 3. That's the water retention cells of the sphagnum. So even after the plant dies and the biomass sort of enters the soil, the water retaining properties of the plant remain. So sphagnum tends to be quite, so peat soils tend to be quite water retaining. And SAR is also sensitive to vegetation structure and also surface motion. And this is where interferometric SAR comes into play. So INSAR is a technique where you look at the differences in the path length of the radar and subsequent passes. And by comparing the distance that the wave has to travel and return to the satellite, you can see very small differences in ground motion. So in peatlands, people use this as a proxy for peatland conditions. So there's the idea that healthy peatlands should oscillate, their surface rises and falls. But it's found that INSAR doesn't work in all peatlands. And so to sort of measure the quality, the expected quality of an INSAR result, we use something called the interferometric coherence, which is basically just we're looking at in a repeat pass satellite, so the satellite's in the exact same position, we see how correlated the two images are. So low coherence indicates that the scattering process has changed in a random way. So we expect this in sort of vegetated natural targets like forests and wetlands, because there's going to be random differences due to sort of fluctuations in vegetation wetness. If there's wind blowing and the leaves change in orientation, that can also cause coherence to be reduced. And then in contrast, high coherence, we expect in sort of hard targets. So urban environments tend to be very coherent, exposed rock, that sort of thing. So high coherence is necessary for interferometric SAR, because you hope that the only difference in the image should be due to the changing of the ground surface, but it's actually can be like confounded by all of these factors. And so coherence in peatlands generally, peatlands tend to not be very coherent, most of them, in fact, due to the vegetation. On these two images here, so on the left is one of our research sites. Quinn talked about it briefly near Tomahawk, Alberta. You can't pick out the peatland from the surrounding agricultural areas and the forests, which you can see here are dark and not very coherent. So there's really, most peatlands can't really be distinguished from the background, and they tend to be low coherent like most other natural targets. But in contrast, on the right here, we can see that some peatlands are very coherent. This is Alfred Bog, just a few hours east of Ottawa. And you can see, so brighter pixels here are more coherent. So you can see that in contrast to the agricultural areas, with the exception of some fields, it's actually quite coherent. So it's a good candidate for INSAR. And we've actually found in the past that you get good INSAR results in Alfred. And so the research question really is, why are some peatlands coherent while others are not? No one's really considered this, and it's sort of important if we're going to be applying INSAR techniques across peatlands in Canada or across the world. It's important to understand where we can use it, where we can't, and why this happens. And so from my perspective, I'm really interested in considering it by peatland type, and I'm really thinking in terms of bog, poor fen, and rich fen. So just very briefly, bogs have low nutrient availability. They're acidic. They're characterized by mosses, black spruce, species that can tolerate this environment. And then rich fens tend to be more, they're groundwater fed, and they tend to have more variety and more vascular vegetation. And then poor fens are hydrologically a fen, so they're groundwater fed, but they tend to have vegetation similar to a bog because they tend to be more acidic and dominated by these mosses. So to do this, there's a publicly available data set, the Global Sentinel-1 seasonal coherence data for the year 2021. And this is Sentinel-1, which is a C-band SAR satellite. And they have 12, 24, 36, and 48-day coherence broken down by season. So this just means back when we had 2 Sentinel satellites in operation, I guess we will again soon, but we used to get repeats every 12 days. Now it's 24 for most areas. And so it's just basically what has changed in 12 days, what has changed in 24 days, what has changed in 38 days, and what has changed in 48 days. And we have this broken down by season. And we combine this with available maps of peatlands. So this is our peatland map. Yasmin talked about it briefly. This is a map I made in for my master's thesis. So it's a moderate resolution 30 meters map of Canadian subclasses. So bog, rich fen, poor fen, and peatlands underlain by permafrost for the Canadian boreal region and sort of hemiboreal as well. And then we also use peatland maps and data that was available for Ireland and the West Siberian lowlands in Russia. The West Siberian lowlands in Russia, I believe, is the largest peatland complex in the world. It's similar in scale to Hudson's Bay, the Hudson Bay lowlands. And I think that Russian peatlands tend to be understudied, at least in the journals I read. So I think it's important to pull that out as well, because it is such a massive pool of carbon. And to see if we could find maybe some other variables that contribute to the coherence, I also used a higher resolution canopy height model of the Earth. So this is by Lang et al. 2023. This was a big deal when it came out. It's a canopy height model for the whole world. So trying to see if the vegetation is a big influence. And so when we start to look at the results, these are just box plots of 12-day coherence for different seasons across all of the maps. I just intersected coherence with the peatland maps and just pulled out some random samples. So we can see that overwhelmingly bogs are more coherent, which is conceptually you would expect, because they tend to have a lower water table, and there's less sort of vegetation influence due to the lack of trees generally, and lack of just vascular vegetation in general. And so in all seasons, I chose spring, summer, and fall. 12-day here, 12, 24, 36, and 48 days. The relationship between the peatlands is the same, where bogs are more coherent, just the magnitude decreases. And it gets less coherent as you have more and more time in between observations. So bogs overwhelmingly are more, in general, are more coherent than fens. It gets a little bit more interesting if we look at it by country. So in Canada, bogs are more coherent than fens, but in the Russian peatlands and the West Siberian lowlands, there's actually not a huge difference between the two. And in some cases, actually, the fens tend to be a little bit more coherent, which I thought was super interesting. I don't really have a good reason for that yet. I think I need to investigate sort of the more different, like what defines those peatlands as unique in comparison to the Canadian ones and the Irish ones, which tend to resemble the Canadian ones, only bogs or fens are even less coherent. But that's sort of an interesting result. And one thing I looked at was to see if maybe it's a latitude factor, because the West Siberian lowlands is quite high latitude. But even if I get the high, like greater than 60 degrees north from Canada, that same relationship is there, and the same relationships are there. So it's not a latitudinal factor specifically. I also looked at some bioclimatic variables, but there was no strong relationships there. And then something else I did was that since we have more class detail in Canada, I also took a look at that. And I think the interesting thing here is that poor fens and bogs, the coherence for fens is similar regardless of whether they're rich or poor. And this is, you would expect, if vegetation was the dominant influence, you would expect poor fens and bogs to be more similar because they tend to have similar vegetation. But rich fens and poor fens are almost identical here. And so this sort of indicates that in Canada, at least, hydrology is the dominant factor in peatland coherence and control on backscatter. And this is sort of confirmed looking at canopy height. You'd expect as canopy height, so this is not the prettiest scatter plot just because both of these data sets are integers, so it forms this grid. But there is a moderate negative relationship. You can see that as canopy height increases, coherence decreases, and you would expect this because at lower canopy heights, you would expect more open areas or shorter vegetation like shrubs, and this would result in less random scattering from the canopy, which we call volume scattering, and less vascular vegetation. So there's also fewer double bounce and different types of backscatter happening. And so in conclusions, this is quite preliminary work. This is hot off the press, so there's still a lot of investigations to be done, but it's interesting to see that there's differences in these peatland types, and people are trying to use INSAR time series of ground motion to sort of flag peatlands as being restored or healthy, or using it as an indicator of degradation. And these sorts of studies make their way into policy decisions and greenhouse gas inventories and that sort of thing. So it's important to sort of take a step back and look at the peatlands that we're analyzing and sort of actually try to understand what's going on with the radar in the peatland. And so in general, bogs are more coherent than fen. This is likely due to the deeper water table. So when the water table is high, it becomes capillarily linked to the near surface soil moisture. And so you tend to see, it tends to be wetter and you get some variation. But with the deeper water table, it's separate. And so the surface could be more stable in that way. And there's less vascular species. So there's a picture of a bog up here. It's largely just shrubs with some isolated trees, as opposed to fens, which can be full of willows. And in this case, it's white spruce, which is quite rare, but tons of can be completely forested. And there's sort of natural variations in coherence. So different countries, different areas, different regions have different coherence for their peatland. So it's important to consider the geographic context as well. And so thank you. That's the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was super interesting to learn about the difference between bogs and other peatlands. Thank you to all three presenters for sharing your work today. And I will open it up to the group. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I can read them or raise your hand and ask through audio.
I have a couple of technical questions maybe to begin with, and I'm not sure who to address it to, but whoever is appropriate. In the SAR images, you mentioned various interferences, including surface motion. Do you also get an interference from surface roughness? And can you measure that? Does that change significantly?
Yeah, so surface roughness is considered to be one of the primary influences on backscatter. And yes, you can measure it. So usually you go out with either, there's sort of like a laser system you can do it with, or you can do it with high resolution imagery from a drone, or you can just measure it with sort of, there's like this sort of like pin board that you lie on the surface and it will outline the roughness. So usually you're looking at, yeah, like sort of the deviation from what you would think the ground surface is.
But yeah,
in peatlands, there hasn't been a lot of work in surface roughness, and in my opinion, this is a lot of what my PhD is focused on. Actually, we think that the roughness of the surface is not what is important, but the subsurface. So we think that the incident wavelengths actually, if the surface is dry, will enter the soil. And so there's sort of a subsurface roughness where the soil moisture starts, because I like the way I'm conceptualizing it is that with microwaves, we're remote sensing water, and it's if the water is at the surface, then it will be the surface roughness. If the water is below the surface, then it will be the subsurface roughness.
Right.
Yeah.
So from what you say, you still have to use a manual a manual method of measuring the surface roughness. You can't do it from the satellites, unfortunately.
No, yeah, you need much higher resolution.
Yeah. Actually, talking about the resolution, I think it was Yasemin that mentioned that you had quite a big pixel or resolution for the images. Is that right? But I think you, Nick, mentioned a 30-meter pixel. I wasn't quite sure whether we were talking about the same thing for the SAR resolution.
So I was talking about radiometers. So we do have two sensors, SMAP and CMOS, and both of them are larger than 36 kilometers in pixels.
Right. Wow. Yes. Okay. Whereas Nick was talking of much smaller pixel sizes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Great presentations, by the way. Very interesting stuff. I don't think we realized how complex all of this was. I didn't, anyway.
Just reading a question from the chat from Bill. Just a question about ground truth for SAR estimates of soil moisture, which is used to predict forest fire severity. In particular, Quinn noted that 57% of the peat was burned in 2023, compared to much lesser numbers in normal years. So the question is, did you estimate or measure soil moisture at a depth of 10 or 20 centimeters when satellite-derived estimates seem to be restricted to the top 2 to 3 centimeters?
So I think that's probably a question for me. This was not our study. This was a study of our partner lab led by Sophie Wilkinson. And these were field-based estimates, not satellite estimates. So soil moisture was measured using field instruments, peat cores, water loggers, water table loggers, and it was site specific. It was not referring to all of 2023. If we could get peat burn depth for the country, that would be incredible, but it would require probably wall-to-wall LiDAR flights before and after the fires. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, if you want deep soil moisture measurements, typically the standard right now is field measurements, although we are sort of exploring some technological advances that we might be able to use to look deeper remotely.
So much. Just while we wait for other questions, I have one for you, Quinn, based on your presentation. I was aware through the media of zombie fires and wasn't quite knowledgeable of how they worked, but I was wondering if there's any frameworks or regulations that point to the management of these fires, or if they're a necessarily new phenomenon that we're just learning how to tackle as we see them pop up.
Okay, fire question. This is a really, really interesting topic because they are rare and they are difficult to fight for many reasons. First, it's detection. You can't find them. Sometimes there's some smoke in the air, but what firefighters will do if they suspect the holdover fire is occurring under the snowpack is they do this terrifying thing called cold trailing, where you can only do it when there's not a lot of snow there, but you literally feel for the fire with your hands. Like that's the sort of sensitivity you need to detect these low heat fires. So detecting them from space, kind of out of the question currently. UAVs might work. Managing these fires, typically right now, what agencies do is they catalog the fires, and then when spring comes, they can action them before they become a problem. They can't really put them out in the winter for multiple reasons. The water's frozen, you can't pump surface water that's frozen, and the agencies staff down in the winter. We've never had to fight winter wildfires, though, with the rare exceptions. So there's just not a lot of active people on the ground to fight them. So yeah, they're currently a concern and not one that we've dealt with, but not one that's on the same scale as, Fort McMurray or Jasper burning wildfires. Those are still the primary risk I don't want to blow them out of proportion.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting nonetheless, and definitely one of those instances where a phenomenon is so new that the science involved feels a little bit Wild West. But we
Yeah.
do have a question from the chat, so I'll read it. It's actually for you, Quinn. You mentioned the standard tools for burn area mapping like NBR. What would be the most authoritative source of burned area data right now in Canada, understanding the errors in these maps that you discussed?
Yeah, so the authoritative source is the National Burned Area Composite, NBAC, that's put out by CFS, Canadian Forest Service. You can find it. I can probably drop a link in the chat if you want. That's the most valuable way. So you need to request a certain degree of granularity. If you want the actual maps of individual fires for producing the best possible estimate, you want NBAC. That's a spatial data set. It's large. You need to be able to process it. If you want rough estimates, you go to the Canadian Wildland Fire Information System, also with NRCan. So they're the sort of authority for getting burned area data. And I'll just drop a link in the chat. If you give me a second here. This is the, let's see. This is great. I'm Googling while I'm speaking. This is the location. And if you need a specific data product, feel free to email me and I can point you to the right one.
Great, thanks for those resources. There's an additional question that I'll pose to the group and anybody can answer on this one. Is there universal depth to measure soil moisture on a global scale?
I'm not certain about that. I'm sure that there's like international projects that would have standards. But for in general, there tend to be sort of like, I tend to see smaller groups coming up with their own standards. Like there's there's one of the biggest measures of peatland soil moisture, at least, is it's Yazzie, do you remember the name of the program that operates at Merbleu?
Marble? No. Are you talking about Emerfluxes?
Yeah, Ameriflux, yeah. So they measure at, I think, like 3 and 5 centimeters generally. It tends, there's really no consistency. But it's almost, for SAR at least, you expect there to be variable penetration depth into the soil. So for soil moisture, depending on the soil and the conditions above the soil, you would expect to have you would expect it to be interacting with the soil moisture at different depths. And so you sort of want to change to create the strongest correlation with SAR, at least, you would want to be measuring at different depths. Recording soil moisture at different depths.
Super interesting. It's, yeah, definitely difficult to create global harmony on science sometimes. Building off the global perspectives, how well are peatlands represented in land surface classification schemes in the most recent IPCC climate models?
So I know about this a little bit because I do some work with, or I collaborate a bit with the pollutant inventory reporting division at ECCC, which uses the Canadian model for peatlands to account for peatlands in Canada's forest emission estimates, which I believe is what goes on to the IPCC for Canada's global reporting in the global context. Peatlands are not very well represented at the moment, but there's a team hard at work doing that. I just saw some in the past. It's based on sort of really coarse resolution maps, and they're sort of decomposition and emission models that are based on sort of relatively few field sites to parameterize these sort of large, really large scale models. But they're I just saw a presentation about the newest estimates for the Alberta oil sands region, and they're using now high resolution peatland maps, and they're really trying to improve the peatlands representation and in in those models, which I assume will lead to the climate models. I'm not super familiar with the climate models, but in an emissions context, that's what they're doing. So I imagine that there would be some sort of trickle down for consistency.
That's all helpful information. Just another question from the chat. Do peat bogs host sufficient heat in the winter to rekindle burning after snow melt?
Yes, they burn very cool, but in the spring in particular, the sort of surface vegetative material is all dry, it's cured, and it doesn't take a lot to get that going again. Hopefully the snowpack is sufficient that when it melts, it kind of puts that fire out or dampens it down. But we see like the definition of a holdover fire is one that starts up. So if it in northeastern British Columbia this year, there was a very, very large fire led to several community evacuations. Oh, the name is escaping me, Donnie Creek, maybe, that burned through 2023. The had a holdover fire, and in the 2024 it started up again and just continued burning. So yeah, it all depends on how much precipitation they get, how deep the snowpack is, and most importantly, how deep they burn. If that water table is low, they can burn many, many meters deep, and then they're just an oven down there, hanging out at 400 Celsius, something particularly low for a fire. Don't quote me on that number though. So yeah, it's a long way of saying yes.
Thanks for that clarification. And the additional information is helpful nonetheless. There's currently no more answers in the chat, but as people are typing potential questions, I also invite folks to feel free to unmute and ask any questions that they may have. Maybe while people are gathering up some questions, I have one for Yasemen. You were discussing how moisture-related indices are some of the most important indicators of fire and drought. I was wondering if there's any way, and this might be a very broad question, but this is not my discipline. I was wondering if there's any potential for this detection or evaluation to be automated potentially on a national or global scale to create indicators that could be used for fire management.
So are you talking about like which indices are more important?
I guess I'm more discussing when you were saying that moisture-related indices are super important indicators within 3 to 6 months of a fire. I was wondering if that detection of those indices could be automated on some level to provide almost like a warning system.
Yeah, so basically we found that, okay, 3 or 6 months before the fire is the most like important duration for finding, okay, the backscatter is decreasing, so we are probably having a drought, and this information is so useful for us for predicting the fire in future. So basically for fire management, we use that information, like those months before the fire, in our models to predict wildfires. So it's kind of using that information in any kind of modeling. Not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And I think my question may have been a bit loopy and confusing because this is a bit far out of my discipline, but super interesting nonetheless. I appreciate it. I'm just going to make a last call for any questions because we have about 5 minutes left in the hour. So yeah, if there's any last few questions or points of discussion, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. Okay, in light of no more questions coming in, I'd like to say thank you to all 3 presenters who joined us today to share their very interesting work. It was great to spend some time and learn a little bit more about peatlands in Canada. I'll hand it over to Frank, who has a few closing words.
Right. Well, thank you very much, all of you, and Erica for managing that. It's very interesting stuff and very complicated. We do have another meeting coming up next month. It won't be about peatlands. It'll be about atmospheric rivers, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. So we should be sending out a notice about that. And again, thank you everybody for putting together a very interesting discussion. Thanks. One final comment is that there